The outrage caused by some groundbreaking output now in Storm Over 4, and the programme does contain strong language, explicit sexual scenes, and Chris Morris.
Now, there have already been misgivings. You probably saw in the paper this morning, one leader talked about your film this evening, in which a mental defective, it said, is sexually molested by a paraplegic dwarf, a very emotive way of putting it. Is this the sort of fare you're going to be risking putting on?
I deliberately... Well, I've always been in favour of taking risks in broadcasting, and I think good broadcasting does take risks.
From its first day on air, Channel 4 was a risk-taker, with a government remit to be different from ITV, to cater for tastes ignored by other channels.
Well, it's been famously said that ITV was a licence to print money. The BBC, of course, has a licence to collect the licence fee. Channel 4, I think, is a licence to be unlicensed. It's a licence to push the old envelope, to push with people's sensibilities.
It was very surprising, actually, to open the tabloids in particular and see this war of fury. My mother did tell me afterwards that she hadn't actually had the courage to confess to her friends that I worked at Channel 4 for months after I'd gone there.
Kiss me, honey, honey. Television had always catered for mass audiences. By appealing to minorities, Channel 4 was on a collision course with the guardians of Middle England.
I think what probably put me off more than anything else was the notion of a lesbian season. It was as though the people running the programmes were saying, we are determined to spit in the face of the bourgeoisie, and this is what we're going to do.
Mary Whitehouse's National Viewers and Listeners Association thought Channel 4 arrogant.
I think that Channel 4 has this attitude of being a latter-day Bismarck, cruising around the airwaves, we're unsinkable. Then I think that they are really adopting an intellectual, this sort of superior media class, where we're going to show what we think is good for you.
In catering for new tastes, Channel 4 was bound to offend old sensibilities.
We had a licence to be different that could involve a licence to be annoying, but there was no point whatever in just being annoying. What we were trying to do was to add to the range of choices available to viewers and to broadcast stuff that some people liked and other people would not like at all.
It was Margaret Thatcher's first government which brought Channel 4 into the nation's living rooms. Many Conservatives at the time believed the new channel would be a haven for programmes about sailing or wine tasting. It was not to be, and the storms began to brew. Channel 4 had commissioned a new soap opera, Brookside, to be made on location in Liverpool. The earthy and realistic portrayal of Liverpudlian life provoked an immediate storm. Many people felt the new drama was too realistic, and it broke one of the greatest taboos of television, the use of bad language on the box.
Door. Yeah, floor. Window. Liar. Now language.
I just thought it'd be interesting to try and do a drama that followed all the social mores, but actually used the same language that people did in everyday life and not sanitised for television.
What the blazes?
But there's this wonderful bit where these kids have been seen rushing out of Paul Collins' house, and when they go up to the bathroom, there's bollocks written in graffiti across one of the walls, and Barry Grant looks at it and says, oh, it wasn't our dame, and he spells it with one L.
That'll do, that's enough of that. In the end, we realised that, when the viewing figures went from 4.2 million to 500,000, there was something that we needed to address. And the big thing that came through, the number one thing that came through all along is that the people just didn't like the language in their living room.
Come on, Bobby!
It hadn't hit me at all until my parents watched it with my 3-year-old son and were shocked and embarrassed, and I suddenly came up front against it then. It made me realise we're going to lose, we're going to actually cut out a lot of our audience who would love this programme, but simply because they're offended by language.
You're a right dickhead, you, aren't you? Don't you start. I'll give you worse than that.
Right from the very beginning, we were fine-tuning. And it was important to listen to the audience and to sense when we were pushing too far at the borders of things.
I love when white dudes get mad and cuss, right? Because y'all some funny motherfuckers when you cuss. Right? They be saying shit like, yeah, come on, peckerhead.
I remember Richard Pryor in concert. Very simple, brilliant performance by an absolute genius of a comic performer, but unbelievably obscene. Every other word was motherfucker. And I looked at this and I thought, goodness, I don't think we can transmit this. It's brilliant, but we can't transmit this, can we?
All right, cut the shit.
The Richard Pryor concert was shown on Channel 4 late at night.
Just cut the fucking crapola.
For the founders of Channel 4, the intention was not to shock or lower moral standards. It was high-minded. Now, President of Magdalen College, Oxford, Anthony Smith, had campaigned for years for Channel 4 and was on the board when the Pryor concert went out.
There are people in this country, and often I feel I'm myself among them, who react, who hate bad language on television, who just feel uncomfortable with it, particularly when there's a lot of it in the space of a single programme.
Come on, you fucking jerk-off! Come on! Son of a bitch, come on!
But some of us realise that it is part of any project of realism, and you have to put up with it, and there you are.
Yeah, you fucking ain't right, buddy.
Media consultant Dorothy Hobson chronicled the story of the first years of Channel 4.
It was actually a surprise to Jeremy Isaacs that people did respond badly to it, because he believed that that was how people spoke in the confines of their own home. But people didn't particularly want to be seeing that on screen, so that was a problem that they did have to deal with, and which he felt he gave in on. And he said, well, I think what's got to happen is the fucks have got to go and the piss-offs have got to be restricted.
I want to forget all of them things.
It seemed every time Channel 4 tried to break the mould, a storm was sure to follow. One of its earliest ambitions was to broadcast the very best of new independent cinema, films like My Beautiful Laundrette. With ITV showing Hollywood blockbusters, the new channel believed it had a remit to support British independent cinema. Supporting new and edgy independent cinema was a personal mission for Chief Executive Jeremy Isaacs. He was a great admirer of the late Derek Jarman, director of the controversial film Jubilee.
When I was the director of programmes at Thames, I used to sit around the programme controllers meeting, and they would be talking about the movies that they'd seen in the cinema over the weekend. And they would go on to say, terrible pity that can't be seen on television, isn't it? This wonderful work, this entertaining work, being made by great filmmakers, somehow can't be shown to people on television because it's too strong for them, and that's nonsense, and if I ever get a chance, I will change it.
Broadcasting Jarman's Jubilee caused such a storm in the media that Channel 4 began to experiment with a warning system, the notorious red triangle.
The channel was based on the idea that you didn't see things by accident. You chose to watch certain programs. You chose not to watch other programs. Still, there were people who said, what would happen if either I, who am easily offended, or my children, who have to be protected, saw things they didn't want to see by accident? I said, OK, I'll put a little mark on the corner of the screen that will warn people that this is a film that might offend them.
From time to time in the late evening, Channel 4 transmits films made for the cinema, which some viewers may find a bit strong for television viewing. This triangle is to tell you that care is required.
They said, oh, well, if anybody comes in and they miss the pre-screen warning, they'll see this red triangle in the corner and they'll know straight away they've got to turn it off. Well, I mean, it was just a fiasco, because what happened is that audiences were double. And I think that they knew jolly well that was going to be the outcome. And, of course, it caused a whole lot of controversy in the tabloid press. One, I think, was Themrock, which was a French film, where they showed these anarchists going out and hunting down a couple of police officers and dragging them back to their den, cut their bodies up and roasted them on a spit. Well, you know, cannibalism is not my style of life. I don't know whose style of life it is. Maybe it's Channel 4's style of life. It's not mine.
In those early years, Channel 4 wasn't chasing ratings. It was on a cultural crusade. It had put up the red triangle reluctantly. In the early 80s, Channel 4 commissioned a gay programme which did not treat homosexuality as a problem. It was a bizarre entertainment show with the title 1 in 5. It hit the headlines before it was due to go on air and was an early episode in the strange love-hate relationship between Channel 4 and the tabloid press. None of the critics had actually seen the programme because the producers were still making it.
We launched our season for winter and Christmas. And there were a whole load of programmes there. And somewhere about page 30 of the pack, there was a reference to a gay programme called 1 in 5. Just one programme, 1 hour long. That's all it was.
Before it went out was The Storm. Before it went out, we were totally wrapped up with editing it and getting it, all the things that you have to do to finish the programme.
The Telegraph the next day picked up on this and they mentioned it in passing, gay programme. The Daily Mail rang up, said, where did this come from? I said, well, actually, it was in the pack, if you look, page 30, and quite a number of your people were there. And, of course, they're not pleased to have missed it, so they actually had to play catch-up.
I was going into the office one day in the middle of the morning on the tube. And I sat down on this seat, and the people were all sitting in a row opposite me with all these newspapers open, and they were sort of going through the pages. And on the front of the papers, it had enormous banner headlines, Ban C4, take this licence away, this programme must not go on, ban the whole channel. I thought, oh, my God, it's us. It's us, it's our programme. We felt quite isolated at the time as the programme makers in our little office. But Channel 4 were phoning us and saying, look, don't worry, you know, this is good news. This, you know, people will watch the programme.
When Channel 4 started, we greeted it with great glee because it was a wonderful new target for us. Channel 4 brought us something new to slag off, and of course, when there's a great puff about what it's going to bring and all the variety and so on, then it's the press's job to knock all that down.
The tabloid papers hounded Channel 4 mercilessly, and the Daily Mail was soon advising viewers on how to detune their sets shortly after instructing them how to tune them in. In the very early days, that's what some viewers like John Wiley actually did.
As they were starting to watch the television, we realised that Channel 4, some of the programming in Channel 4 wasn't quite what we anticipated the children should be watching. So what we did was to detune their television. The elder one then started to make her way into our bedroom. So, of course, then we didn't detune our one in our bedroom, we just locked our bedroom door and made sure it was shut every night before we went out.
The storm movers in the tabloids had at least kept Channel 4 in the public eye. While it faced up to its biggest problem, nobody was watching it. Quickly, the jibes about Channel's swore had turned into sneers about Channel's snore.
A lot of those people who wanted the channel to be there, wanted the programmes to be there, were never going to be in watching programmes themselves. They would be out, you know, being intellectual or being liberal or being a theatre goer. It was almost like Arnoldian in the sense of they wanted the good to be done to the Philistines, or they also wanted the voices heard of people who would not normally be heard, but they might not necessarily be watching them themselves.
It's new, it's bright, and it's the most exciting development in television for years.
I remember thinking, God, a new channel at last, and being really excited by the possibilities of it all. If you asked me then, I would have said, of course I watch it, of course I watch it. But actually, you know, the few times you did watch it, it was pretty awful, wasn't it? And all the cliches about early Channel 4 turned out to be true. And when people are very rude about a typical programme featuring some kind of ghastly discussion about one-legged lesbians or whatever they used to say about it, and I suspect if you watched it all, of course there would have been some gems in there. I don't doubt that for a minute. There would have been wonderful things embedded in it. But there was also hours and hours of tedium. That's how I remember it.
Freedom is indivisible.
I knew nothing about making programmes that were really likely to be fantastically boring, fantastically marginal, out of theory. And the programmes were, just I have to say, some of the programmes were good, but some of them were truly astonishingly boring.
One of the chief errors of modern times, an error I was guilty of for the quarter of a century when I was a socialist, is the belief that we can distinguish between political and economic freedom.
The first time that the Channel 4 board met the commissioning editors, very early in the life of the channel, was nearly, I think, the end of everything. They had thought, I believe, that when we talked about catering for minorities, we meant things like motoring and holidays in Italy and things like the cooking. And instead they were getting lesbian movies and experimental films and all kinds of weird and wonderful stuff. And there was no audience. And they went for us. And we were simply horrified at all this, and we thought we were doing a wonderful job. But the professionals, I think, were astonished at what Jeremy had got them all into.
The ITV companies were funding Channel 4 and hoped to get their money back by selling airtime. They were not amused.
It's Friday, it's 5:30, and that means Spotty Herbert's coming through the door.
But in one area of programming, Channel 4 had found a minority audience the ITV companies had lost touch with and badly wanted, young people. But catering for this age group was bound to lead to trouble.
I don't think Newcastle really worries.
The big success of Channel 4 was that it brought young men to television, because until that they were a very elusive group of viewers.
Doing what he wants to do.
Youth in Channel 4 terms in the early days went up to 35, really. And so they had money to spend. What they brought was a new audience that would actually go out and watch a programme, watch the Tube, watch a band, go out on the Saturday and buy the records.
The Tube gave way to The Word, which became one of the most controversial shows on television. Channel 4 had embarked on an adventure which would cause many a storm. Generations didn't speak the same language, and nothing outraged the tabloids more than The Word.
I was very nervous when I heard that Channel 4 was going to go for the dreaded M-word, minorities, because I thought what that means is horrible, patronising, knee-jerk, Hampstead pinko, liberal left shite. And a lot of the early stuff was exactly like that. The Word. I suppose if you're thinking of the ethos of Channel 4 and where The Word fits into that ethos, you've got to think of it as being a minority unaddressed, i.e. intelligent 15 to 25-year-olds. There's plenty of patronising pap on TV for 15 to 25-year-olds. There's plenty of finger-wagging nonsense, don't do drugs, don't drink too early, don't smoke. There's plenty of advice. But there isn't stuff that reflects the genuine concerns of young people and the fact that they're intelligent and sharp. The magazines were doing it, great magazines like Sky, Smash Hits, ID, Blitz, The Face were doing it. TV wasn't doing it because young people were a foreign country. And they are a foreign country. As Jung said, they're the last savage tribe on earth. And The Word spoke to that savage tribe in its own dialect.
Wayne from Newcastle had his bikini line waxed.
Jesus!
I think that no other channel at the time could have commissioned The Word, because I think that it was a risk. There's no doubt about it.
Pig's eyeballs were on the menu, though, and Roz had a taste, but it went to waste.
In its first years, Channel 4 had found its feet and began to fulfil its remit to cater for new tastes on television. And it was allowed to do so, despite all the stormovers, by a Prime Minister and a government which didn't share its values at all. Why was it allowed to get away with it?
Storm Over 4 continues now, starting with a poem containing the strongest possible language.
What's a creed of cur, cunt? Can't you speak the language that your mum spoke? Think of her. Can you only get your tongue round fucking Greek? Go and fuck yourself with creed of cur. She didn't talk like you do for a start, I shouted, turning where I thought the voice had been. She didn't understand your fucking art. She thought your fucking poetry obscene.
Tony Harrison's heartfelt verse about the desecration of his parents' grave in a Leeds cemetery was broadcast in 1987. It was a frank and dramatic poem which whipped up a storm in the newspapers. The press were confident that this time Channel 4 had gone too far and would be brought to book by the government. Margaret Thatcher was firmly ensconced in Downing Street when Tory MP Gerald Howarth tried to tighten the obscenity laws.
I recall being worried about Tony Harrison's poem called V. I felt that that was kind of in the mould of constantly trying to press forward the barriers of that which was acceptable in terms of language and issues which were being treated by this free-to-roam channel. And that did incense me. Although I have to say, in retrospect, I have some sympathy with Tony Harrison in what he was trying to do. I still don't think it was acceptable to broadcast.
I'll tell you then, what really roused the bloke. It's reading on their graves the jobs they did.
I introduced a private member's bill to tighten up the law of obscenity in the late 80s, but it did get the support of Margaret Thatcher. And when the Prime Minister came into the chamber, she looked round, she looked up at the Strangers' Gallery and saw Mary Whitehouse there, who had actually been a supporter of my bill. And she gave a great sort of warm wave to Mary Whitehouse. And so it was marvellous. The Prime Minister basically put two fingers up to the lovies and said, "There's my friend in the gallery, Mary Whitehouse."
Mary Whitehouse might have expected the Prime Minister's support, but Channel 4 seemed to be immune to Thatcher's legendary anger.
When it came to the programmes that Channel 4 put on, they pushed out the boundaries and they continue to push out the boundaries, and that does strike me as rather a paradox that it should come from the Thatcher era and be so undermining of the cultural standards that maybe Mrs Thatcher was in favour of, when she was Prime Minister.
I think the truth is that the complainers and the agents for those who wanted to complain on the backbenches of the Tory party were Margaret Thatcher's natural allies, Gerald Howarth and whatever. I think that, and they felt that she was on their side, as it were, in wanting decency and wholesomeness on television. After all, Mrs Thatcher supported Mary Whitehouse very strongly. She even presented, you'll recall, the Mary Whitehouse Award for Wholesome Television. Yes, Minister. She even performed with Jim Hacker and Sir Humphrey, a little sketch I wrote for them, when she presented this great award.
Yes, it's all very simple. I want you to abolish economists.
All of them, Bram. So, I mean, there was a natural affinity there. But I can't say that, in my experience, it overlay the activities of Number 10. It was peripheral to them.
There now follows a government warning. The only way to ensure that sex is safe is to use a condom. This man didn't use a condom.
Channel 4 was attracting an increasing number of viewers and was confident that its remit allowed it to broadcast riskier material than other channels. Despite the angry backbench Tory MPs and the newspapers, it seemed Margaret Thatcher had her own reasons for cheering on Channel 4.
We were perfectly well aware that we ran a risk with the sort of authoritarian cultural outlook of the Thatcherites, that they would deeply dislike the knockabout freedom on Channel 4, but we understood perfectly well that we had a powerful weapon with that same constituency in what we did with independent producers. I don't think Mrs Thatcher ever really watched television. I think she was just bemused by the content of Channel 4, but she did understand that we were fostering a group of independent producers who she just saw as the people who were going to bust up the duopoly of BBC and ITV. And it was, I think, a great political protection for the channel.
Unlike ITV, Channel 4 did not make its own programmes. Everything from Brookside to its light entertainment and documentaries was bought from other companies, mostly small independent producers. They were the television equivalent of the small businesses Mrs. Thatcher was championing. To survive in an industry dominated by big business and incredible restrictive practices, independent producers had to find new ways of working.
There's no doubt about it, Margaret Thatcher loved independent producers. I think she probably never saw the stuff that they were making, especially in the early days, but she loved the idea of independent producers because they were the people who were going to drive down costs in the industry, they were the people who were going to break up the old monopolies, and we did. That's what we did. And the whole campaign to get independently produced programmes onto the BBC, onto ITV and so on, it was like pushing at an open door. It was really quite uncanny. And it was Channel 4 that was the bridgehead for that.
There was a huge irony in the fact that we had the perception of being the sort of left-wing, sort of loony channel, and that quite a lot of our output was left-wing. It was different, but partly because of this vacuum that we're filling. But because the big irony was that here we were created by a Tory government and doing this left-wing stuff, and we were a myriad of little businesses. The independent sector was very small then, and it was the ultimate Thatcherite dream.
In bringing realism to the dialogue with which Liverpudlians communicate with one another, it's already outraged Mrs Mary Whitehouse, Tory backbenchers, and Home Secretary Willie Whitelaw has found its charms to be somewhat limited.
While the economics of independent production transformed the industry, Home Secretary Willie Whitelaw kept an eye on the programmes on Channel 4.
She had very great confidence in Willie Whitelaw. I mean, she once said to me, whatever makes Willie happy makes me happy, because she could rely on him absolutely. He was not a threat to her. And I think that she no doubt relied upon Willie to get Channel 4 broadly right. And I think we can probably say he got it broadly right.
I heard from him on the day that we went on the air, and I pinned his letter of good wishes to the wall. A few months later, it was all a bit rough. There was too much criticism of the channel, and he did me the courtesy of saying, come and have a chat. And he took me to lunch at one of his clubs at Bucks, and we had gull's eggs or something. And he said, go easy a bit, lad, don't make life any more difficult for me than you absolutely need to. It could not have been done more gently.
When he had agreed for it to go forward, he thought special interest groups meant golfers, and yachting enthusiasts. And then when he saw the channel that was full of the most extraordinary people doing the most extraordinary things, he was slightly taken aback. But, I mean, Whitelaw, in that paternalistic Tory tradition way, kind of thought, well, that's good enough for the servants.
There was in the first years of Channel 4 a regulator which could censor or ban its programmes, the Independent Broadcasting Authority. The IBA drew the line on this film and wanted to censor it.
We were producing a series called Visions about world cinema, and we wanted to do something about censorship. We knew about what happened in Brazil, which was the generals, when they took over with a very repressive regime. They were censoring all art films and so on. So the filmmakers, the experimental filmmakers, found that they could make critical films in the genre of softcore porn.
Não existe pecado do lado de baixo do Equador.
We knew that there would be problems, so we talked to Channel 4. We didn't make a programme and present it to them and say, here you are, do something with it. We talked to them through the programme process. We showed them rough cuts, so it was in the schedules, and the very day of transmission, suddenly somebody bottled out in Channel 4, sent a preview tape to the IBA, and the man at the IBA was suitably shocked and said, this cannot go on. And so it was pulled from the schedules about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So then they started sending letters to us. They sent letters referring to sequences like The Man in the Hat. This is a piece of softcore porn. Very funny, actually. It's a man in a hat and nothing else having sex with a woman, and she's making all kind of comments. And as soon as he's finished, she makes an entirely derogatory comment about him.
Como é que com essa grana toda você mora num lugar tão fodido, hein?
It's a very funny sequence. The man in the hat became the big stumbling block with the IBA. They said, well, take the picture out. It's an offensive picture. So that's precisely what we did. We took out the picture, we left the sound, and we put in a caption saying, censored by the IBA. It was, after all, a programme about censorship. We sent this off to them, and they said, you can't do that. It's even worse without the picture. And anyway, you cannot say on air that this programme has been censored by the IBA. So that was the end of the matter, and the programme sat on the shelf, I think, for 6 years.
So I was looking forward con mucho gusto to Wednesday night's Visions program, and what a shock to be told the IBA cancelled it at the last minute. Now, the IBA has come in for a lot of stick, but this is too silly even for them, and I have a probable explanation. The Brazilian military censorship, at the moment between engagements, has arranged a summer holiday exchange with the IBA, who are at this moment somewhere on a beach in Rio. If this is true, it was a mistake. Cancelling the show wasn't funny. Suddenly, it's not just them over there pushing their own around. Suddenly, they're over here pushing us around. Please come back from Rio, IBA. Wednesday night, somebody took your place, and he thinks he's my daddy.
There are major changes to the way commercial television is regulated.
The Thatcher government set out to deregulate major industries, including television. The IBA became a prime target. It was scrapped and replaced by a lighter touch regulator, the ITC. Channel 4's freedom apparently increased.
In the early days, the Independent Television Commission had the right to finally decide what was transmitted on all commercial channels. But that changed with the new Broadcasting Act, and Channel 4 was in the position to decide for itself what it could transmit, and that was also a liberating factor. And the band season grew out of that. We had the chance to get on air films and programmes that either Channel 4 or other channels had actually dodged and not screened before, and that was really quite a challenge.
In the band season, The Man in the Hat finally made it to the screen. But Channel 4 was soon to face the biggest challenge to its risk-taking remit since its launch. It would have to sell its own advertising and to become commercially viable. Would Channel 4 play safe when money was at stake? Or would it continue to be one of the strangest success stories of the Thatcher era?
People talk a lot about Thatcher's legacy, the good and the bad, and nowadays a lot of commentators, unthinking commentators, focus on the bad. But every night I get down on my metaphorical knees and thank Margaret Thatcher for Channel 4. It was her gift to world culture, her gift to television, with a bit of help from Willie Whitelaw. And she's given us what? Brookside, The Word, After Dark with Oliver Reed. It's been a fantastic television ride. Margaret, thank you. We love you.
And I wake up and she's sleeping. Her little heart is beating, and she's breathing soft and gentle, and her breasts, they gently rise and gently fall.
Channel 4 was the first television station to provide a home to alternative comedy. And it was another source of trouble. Who Dares Wins in its pilot show with Rory McGrath caused a storm.
I love her, and she looks at me and says, who the fuck are you? Who the fuck are you?
The first show out live, and the morning after, it was the only time that Jeremy Ives ever ran me at home, and he woke me up, I was sleeping, and he said, Mike, he said, I think we've done it this time. I said, what have we done? I said, and I was sort of half asleep, and I said, well, was it that road accident sketch, or was it the Who the Fuck Are You song? No, he said, we've upset the Christians, and I went, uh-oh.
Blasphemy was a recurring problem on Channel 4. Church-going readers of the Daily Mail were particularly incensed.
Good evening and welcome to Right Reply. This week, a Channel 4 executive and one of his producers stand accused by viewers of blasphemy and bad taste on Channel 4. In a decision that others of you might think outrageous, the channel have refused to let me show you the sketch of Christ on the cross smoking in a parody of the familiar Hamlet cigar ad.
The thing that amazed me was getting letters from vicars and ministers of the Church of Scotland describing how I would burn and blister in hell for having done this terrible thing. So the act of Christian charity was sort of lost on me there, but...
Who Dares Wins never went out live again after the crucifixion sketch, and each show was vetted by a minder. When in 1987 Michael Grade became Channel 4's high-profile chief executive, there was a widespread belief that Channel 4's risk-taking days were over. In his previous job at the BBC, Grade had said Channel 4 should be privatised, a threat that has hung over it ever since. But in his new role, Grade heeded the old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
It's an old expression that you don't rewrite a hit, and I have no intention of doing that.
Well, the public perception of the channel was surprisingly relaxed, actually. When you consider that all the storm over it, he quite liked a wee bit of the sex and violence, and, you know, bums and tits were rather approved of. But by and large, they had a licence from the public to take television forward.
Under Michael Grade's leadership, Channel 4 continued to push back the boundaries with some remarkable programmes, like this documentary about prostitution in New York.
Some areas we can't tell, but...
The programme I think I'm most proud of having commissioned in all my career in television was a documentary by Biban Kidron called Hookers, Hustlers, Pimps and Their Johns, which began as a survey of the sex trade in New York, but when Biban did it, it amounted to something quite different. It was her view of what prostitution was and what the relationship of a prostitute was with her clients. It was viewed in my company by a barrister, and the barrister hilariously gave us a very erudite exposition of something called the Spanner precedent, in which it was established in Birmingham that consensual sadomasochistic acts were not necessarily legal. But ultimately, very, very little was cut from the film. Great scenes, the scenes that everyone remembered. The urine drinking scene.
Salty, very salty.
I'm sorry to say, but it had a kind of tenderness. There was a kind of relationship between this very old Italian and the dominatrix that was real. It was real.
The reason Channel 4 had from the start been able to take risks, experiment and often outrage was that it had a secure income from the ITV companies. All this altered after it had been on air for 10 years and it was instructed to sell its own advertising. This was a critical change.
The reason it was so possible and so easy for the channel in its first days to be so brave was that Channel 4 did not have the immediate responsibility for seeing to it that the money to keep the channel going came in week by week. Other people did that. And now the channel sells its own airtime. The commercial pressures to perform and to generate ratings are much, much stronger and always will be than they were in the beginning.
Programmes like The Word did not change overnight. They'd always drawn attention to themselves and put up a spirited defence in the face of almost continual tabloid outrage.
The problem with a lot of the tabloid coverage was that they would say, it's a disgrace. They had a bursting colostomy bag on The Word last night. They had a man pulling weights with his penis. They had somebody drinking their own vomit and then bringing it up again and drinking it again. What they didn't realise was, and it's all about that fantastic, you know, postmodernist word, the context, the inverted commas. That idea didn't come from nowhere. What was happening in a lot of the clubs and discos at that time was they were having vile contests. They were getting people on stage to kind of bob for tampons or to gargle with frog spawn. And this was happening in clubs, and we thought, right, well, we don't just want to go and cover this. What we'll do is we'll kind of be clever with it. We'll shoot it in an LE way with lots of people waving at camera, and we'll find those people who used to write to us all the time and say, I'd be a great word presenter, I'd do anything to get on the telly.
This show gets raunchier and raunchier every week. It's the government guidelines.
But the channel was already reinterpreting an early Channel 4 slogan and giving it a new meaning, not so much thought-provoking as attention-grabbing.
We wanted it to be the old Channel 4 slogan, which was television to talk about. And that was why some of the more provocative and outrageous things went onto the word, so it could be talked about. Now, nobody talks about vileness for its own sake. You just switch off. But if things are presented in a vaguely challenging but also witty way, then you are going to chat about it, because you're going to say, I couldn't quite believe that. How did they persuade what was going on there? And why was that man drinking his own vomit but wearing a sequin suit? Why was the sequin suit necessary?
Next on the Red Light Zone, Scarborough Ahoy, the search for sex in seaside Britain.
In an increasingly competitive TV market, Channel 4 seemed to be pre-packaging storms. With the Red Light Zone 48 hours of programming about the sex industry worldwide, it was creating, in effect, a brand image out of notoriety.
Into the erotic.
Taste the politics of sex.
The explicit.
Channel 4 did have, a reputation preceded it, and it was better, in a way, to have Channel 4 being filthy even than have BBC being filthy for the Daily Mail.
So successful was the packaging that viewers assumed that anything rude on television must be Channel 4's.
Sometimes you would get calls from people saying, I was watching that awful, disgusting programme on Channel 4 last night and it was vile and, it's just typical of Channel 4 to be putting in programmes like that. And when you would try to find out the name of the programme they were talking about, and you'd have your TV guide in front of you so you could be looking through it just to make sure you'd find it was either on BBC One, BBC Two, or maybe sometimes even ITV. And so I used to get great pleasure in telling them, I'm sorry, that was actually on BBC Two. You need to phone the BBC, and I'd give them the number and let them phone.
In its late-night schedules with programmes like Eurotrash, Channel 4 celebrated its brand image. In audience terms, Eurotrash was a hit, but with its high-camp innovation and its comic approach to pornography, it was not to everyone's taste. The old rival, the Daily Mail, was pledged to the family and its values, and believed that Channel 4 was mocking them.
There is no doubt that the Mail speaks more clearly than any other organ in the media, in the entire media, for what you might call the right-thinking, church-going, suburban middle classes of Britain. I feel at home with those people. I get enormous numbers of letters from them. And throughout the controversy over Channel 4, the letters they wrote to me were, I should think, something like 98% in favour of what I'd written.
After the Red Light Zone, there was such a fuss and a hoo-ha, and it was a bit of a first. It broke new ground, a new low in the relationship between the channel and newspapers. But almost immediately was commissioned Dyke TV. Now, Dyke is not a word, it's not a Daily Mail word. It's not a word that's shy about itself, is it? Dyke is so deliberately provocative, and the whole thing was just slapping it down deliberately. And they were absolutely complicit, because they would say to you, if you were writing the story, they'd say, oh, and let me point out these 3 or 4 really juicy elements, just so you don't miss the right things to be outraged about. And they'd very much guide you, people within Channel 4, to find the bits that would really have Mary Whitehouse frothing at the mouth and falling over in a dead faint.
The storms continued, but the love-hate relationship that Channel 4 had enjoyed with the press turned from jousting into something more sustained and serious. The Daily Mail inevitably led the charge. Veteran columnist Paul Johnson aimed a polemical attack on Chief Executive Michael Grade, coining the brand name Pornographer-in-Chief.
I use that phrase, pornographer-in-chief, partly because I thought it was accurate, partly because I thought it might have an impact, but partly out of a general sense of outrage. There were some things on that channel which I thought should not have been shown on general television, even late at night, and I always believe in going for the man at the top. I believe in going for the chap who actually presses the button and who is in charge, so that's why I did that.
For his attack, Johnson, not himself an avid viewer of Channel 4, relied on the cuttings from the Daily Mail, which appeared to reveal a crescendo of outrage. A science programme on extreme sex, an attack on Mother Teresa, or films that some Christians claimed were blasphemous. nothing was spared his wrath. At the eye of the storm was the flamboyant Michael Grade. This tirade, suggesting that Channel 4 was out of control, came at the most sensitive time in its history, for the threat of privatisation was real. For once, Channel 4 appeared to batten down the hatches as the storms got stronger.
The last series of The Word particularly, which was actually when the pornographer-in-chief accusations were at their highest, there was huge pressure on Channel 4, which they tried to keep from us, but obviously inevitably did come from us, whereby it meant that some of the items that which we might normally have got away with, they panicked about.
Channel 4 had made itself the centre of all this attention, and everybody was looking, everybody was counting, and it was ridiculous. It was absolutely ridiculous. You couldn't do half the things on Channel 4 you could on BBC 2.
Johnson had tuned into The Girly Show, a replacement for The Word, and had seen an item on men's dirty underpants. This programme was, in fact, a ratings hit, which anticipated the raucous culture of girl power before the Spice Girls came on the scene. But posh it was not, and irritated male readers and politicians alike. The Girly Show arrived just as the threats to privatise Channel 4 were at their most sensitive stage. It was a nervy time when Heritage Secretary Virginia Bottomley came to dinner.
I had a dinner arranged with the Channel 4 board, and we were going to discuss many of the crucial issues of the day. But I thought I should watch a bit of Channel 4 also before I went, to match up their propaganda against the sort of my impressions of their work. And I was frankly appalled.
I can recall very well when Virginia came to the board, and she was still seething with her reaction to a particular programme, which was The Girly Show.
I thought it was vulgar, it's lewd, it's really completely out of order. But it's certainly not a programme that any young women I would know would want to watch.
I think when the Secretary of State comes to dinner and there are so many important things on the agenda, it's curious that The Girly Show is the thing that floats up to the top.
Various brave souls were clearly put up to sort of give a frightfully serious defence of it.
All of us defended it very vigorously, whilst honestly admitting its flaws.
We listened to her views, but they were her subjective views of that programme.
Hello, boys. In my view, they would have been better to laugh and say, well, you know, we don't win them all. And I'm pleased to say the programme did come off quite shortly afterwards.
With privatisation threatened and pressure from politicians and the Mail, Channel 4 had perhaps been too successful in creating a brand image.
Channel 4, partly as a consequence of having to sell its own airtime, came fatally to believe in its own marketing image.
I feel today that the channel is a bit too slick.
If I have a criticism of it, I think that as the years went by, it poured more and more of its innovative energy into a rather narrow range of programming, into the sort of red light zone, sexually daring stuff.
In recent years, one tends to get a great deal of gratuitous emphasis on sexuality in its programmes.
When it's functioning really well, Channel 4 is surprising, not necessarily shocking, but surprising across every single range of the whole range of programming.
You don't feel that you're in the presence of that you're watching anything experimental, either in terms of the programmes or the people making the programmes.
The branding, the wrapping of cellophane with Channel 4, the building, the kind of Christo-like packaging up of Channel 4 became more interesting than, to the people who worked at Channel 4, than the individual programmes, the artefacts.
I do feel that the channel might have got itself into a bit of a cul-de-sac and is now probably already finding its way out of that cul-de-sac into something else.
Virginia Bottomley ruled out privatisation, but the threat was still there when another storm raged within Channel 4 itself. Brass Eye, the wicked satire on current affairs programmes devised by the maverick comedian Chris Morris, sorely tested Channel 4's nerve. Did they dare transmit it? Grade battled it out with his editors.
Well, I think every animal has as much right to decent treatment as we do.
Yeah. You're wrong, and you're a grotesquely ugly freak. Thanks. Animal rights. It's an extremely controversial subject, and it's not just the odd dinner party punch-up over squealing meat.
One way that Brass Eye showed Channel 4 at its strongest was that although I and the lawyers had nursed it through and felt we could manage all the risks, Michael Grade had some reservations about it and decided we couldn't transmit some of the episodes. To his credit, he then came along to a meeting of all the commissioning editors, 40 or 50 people, commissioning editors and deputies, and we had the most fantastically articulate, passionate debate about the meaning of Channel 4 and about this particular programme. And it began to turn Michael's views. And after a lot more hard work, Michael finally decided that the programmes should be transmitted after all, which they were, to great acclaim. And that was Channel 4 at its finest.
Michael Grade left Channel 4 as abruptly and unexpectedly as he had arrived. Another era was over. The political climate had changed. The Tory government, which had nurtured Channel 4 from infancy, was gone. As Tony Blair took office, Channel 4 appointed a new chief executive, Michael Jackson. He'd come from the BBC, where, he was quick to confess, he'd had to reject Brass Eye because it was too hot for the BBC to handle. Jackson has inherited the risk-taking mantle of Channel 4 in an era where a new kind of morality is in the air. The forecast is more storms ahead.
Well, next on 4, appropriately enough, it's Bernardo Bertolucci's Last Tango in Paris, a film which earned Marlon Brando an Oscar nomination and its director worldwide notoriety.